we've seen mass protests all around the country fighting against Netanyahu, who, to everyone who doesn't know, has been prime minister for over 11 consecutive years now. So that's also after a shorter stint as prime minister in the 90s. So in fact, Netanyahu has been prime minister for most of my life, the vast majority of it. And I think another thing that is really interesting to see on like how young people are going to fight against him. Some young people don't even remember a time when he was in office. So I think these protests are really impressive. And recently we've seen Netanyahu even try to restrict the right to protest under the guise of COVID, which has come to bite him in the back massively. Hopefully we can talk about this a little bit in a bit. So Yasha, can you tell us a little bit about the situation with COVID in Israel and Palestine at the moment? Like, I know that there was a fairly successful early lockdown, but then we've seen a major second spike in the last few months. So much that the Israeli state became, I think, one of the first countries in the world to go into a second lockdown. So what's happening with that?
I mean, it's a huge crisis. Yeah, it's like all over the world, like in all other countries, but even more so, it's a health crisis, it's an economical crisis, it's a social crisis, and it's all compound together. And I think that Netanyahu's regime is responsible for the total neglection and not readiness of the health system to tackle this pandemic in Israel, with lack of staff, lack of ICU beds, etc. But also he's responsible for the horrific situation in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and particularly in Gaza, when after 13 years of siege, the hospitals were on the verge of collapse already before the pandemic. And when there was like a huge poverty and unemployment already before the pandemic. And what the pandemic and also the lockdowns, because like in the West Bank, in Gaza, I mean, there was lockdowns that was declared by the local Fatah and Hamas administrations. What this means is that families cannot bring literally food to the table. And inside Israel, within the green light, I mean, obviously Netanyahu is saying that the fact that Israel was the first state to announce second lockdown is a great achievement. It's like we are, like he's saying that like Israel is like one step ahead in corporation to other countries of the world, the first one to have the second wave, the first one to have the second lockdown. And there was also a survey in Israel, and around 60% of the people think that we are heading to a third lockdown in the winter. So this is tell you something about trust in government, because I mean the numbers of people hospitalized, they went down as the result of the second lockdown. No doubt about it. So there is less pressure on on hospitals, which is a good thing, but it's not the whole picture. It's only a very small part of the picture, because the whole picture is that there is like 1 million unemployed, which is somewhere between 15 to 20%. There is a huge economical crisis. There is a huge social crisis. And when you look at the pandemic itself, there was like a study by the one of the institutes, by Weizmann Institute in Israel, and they revealed that your chance to catch COVID if you live in one of the poorest towns and communities in Israel is 6 times higher compared to the richest towns and communities. And what is need to be taken into account is that also a large part of the poorest communities in Israel is Palestinian communities of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. But this crisis is also affect massively the Israeli Jews, and particularly Orthodox Jews, and there is also scapegoating and incitement against the poorest communities to blame them actually for the fact that there is a huge rates of COVID infection in their towns. So this is also part of how this government is managing the pandemic, of creating those prejudice and obstacles for a policy that can really pave a way forward for exit strategy out of this crisis.
Yeah, and I think, especially in the context of the fact that there have been 3 elections in Israel last year, and the only reason why there is a government right now is because it's kind of like this fake crisis government that allowed Netanyahu to be the prime minister again, even though the majority of people did not vote for him and did not want him there. And I think that also kind of brings us to the question of these mass protests. I know that Netanyahu is standing trial for corruption. And do you think that the mass movement there started, like, is it because of the corruption, or is it deeper than that?
Well, taking into account of what we said now about the health crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, I mean, obviously it's much deeper than that. But what we saw during the beginning of the pandemic in the spring, like half a year earlier, is that Netanyahu actually managed to maneuver and to establish a new government with a certain support among some layers of the population that were saying that in this kind of crisis, with this kind of pandemic, to have some kind of government is better than have no government. And this is also on the basis of shock and fears of what's going to happen next, etc. But then the support for Netanyahu went down from 56% approval for his tackling of the pandemic in March, in the spring, to only 27% now in September. And obviously the change is not because of the corruption, because the corruption everything was known already before the elections, but it is particularly the health, economical, and social crisis that came to the fore. And I mean, there is no support for the unemployed. Almost. I mean, the unemployment benefits are very small in Israel. It's somewhere between 60% to 70% at best. And for people under the age of 28, it is even less than that. And there is a massive youth unemployment because the economy, particularly in cities like Tel Aviv, is based on retails, hospitality, restaurants, pubs, tourism, etc. And all of this is gone, and there is no compensation. Yeah, let's put it frankly. I mean, because of the 10,000s that went out to the streets and also some strikes in some sectors, we can see a little bit more compensation money being given to some layers during the months of summer, but it's still not enough, and it's still nothing of what is needed. So, I mean, one of our slogans is that there is no health and no livelihood, and workers, particularly female workers, but also workers in general, are forced to choose between health and livelihood. But there is plenty of police brutality. There is plenty of fines for people that are not, following the COVID rules, etc. So the government policies is only to enforce it by force. There is a huge also crisis in society of violence against women and femicide. And part of this crisis is the fact that those authorities that should have taken care of this, like, social workers and different emergency centers, they are underfunded. Some of them are dependent only on donations. They don't receive the budgets, some of the budgets that the government already agreed to allocate to them, but they are like slow in giving this money because they are hopefully want to not to not to do that, to save this money, and at the same time, there is huge resources that are being given, huge sums that are given to the biggest corporations in Israel, to the richest tycoons. So obviously, all of the class contradictions are also coming to the fore.
Yeah, I think it's like, there's so many reasons to go out in the streets. So it also makes sense that Netanyahu was freaking out a little bit and trying to restrict protests. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, he tried to use the second lockdown as a pretext to attack demonstrations. And he called the demonstrators that are gathering every Saturday for week after week inside of his official residency in Jerusalem as spreaders of COVID. And I mean, for one particular moment, it also seems that at the start of the second lockdown, this would be some public support for that, because some of the people were saying, yes, the situation is so bad that allowing demonstrations would be really dangerous in terms of pandemic. But then when Netanyahu doubled down on it, so it was the opposite reaction, with tens of thousands going to protest near their homes, because demonstrations were restricted to only 1 kilometer from the place that you are living, from your home. So people were having small protest pickets outside of their homes, inside the neighborhoods, in different junctions, like on bridges, etc. And in Tel Aviv, there was, by the end of the day, also marches of thousands of young people who were resisting those undemocratic attacks on the right to protest against the government that they are fed up with, who are trying so cynically to use the real threat and danger of Corona to clamp down on democratic rights.